Historically, husbandry problems have been the demise of a lot of pet birds. These birds are brought out of the wild, and we don't always know what the proper environment, food, humidity, all those things will contribute to the bird's health. What is the right thing that we can do for our animals? And so by making the husbandry correct for these birds, we can really create an environment that they can thrive in. So the objectives of this first lecture are going to be to learn basic principles of appropriate caging, enrichment, temperature, and humidity, and then understand the importance of research and species differences when making recommendations for appropriate husbandry. So our recommendations can vary. So depending on our species, where they're from, what kind of environment they're going to be kept in, our recommendations for that particular bird in that household can vary. When we have a bird that comes into a clinic, or if this is your particular bird that you're bringing in, some of the things that we like to do as veterinarians is to do an initial examination and really talk to you about what are the requirements for this bird. So during that initial exam, some of the things that we like to do is recommend a quarantine. So most birds we recommend a quarantine for 30 to 45 days. And the idea behind that quarantine is that if they are carrying some sort of infectious disease, they're going to actually break with some sort of illness in that amount of time period. And if they're quarantined, they won't give it to other birds in your household. Now, if this is your only bird, then you don't have to worry about quarantine quite as much. But if you do have a multi-bird household, that's when quarantine can be really important when you're bringing a new bird in. Also for that new bird, we certainly recommend an examination by a veterinarian that is familiar with avian medicine. In those examinations, we're going to look at the bird, doing just a regular physical exam. We're also probably going to recommend doing some testing to look for certain infectious diseases, and also sometimes blood work to look and see, does this bird's blood, both with a complete blood count and a biochemistry panel, does it look pretty normal? And if it is normal, fantastic. That gives us a baseline for the future, so we know what is normal in this particular bird. There are a number of other tests that I've got listed here that may or may not be recommended, depending on your veterinarian, your bird, and what sort of situation that bird came from and is going to. Another thing that's really important is going to be caging. And so thinking about what you're going to actually keep that bird in is going to be important. Ideally, you want something that's really pretty easy to clean. Birds can be very messy, and they're constantly throwing food out. You'll have fecal matter that's around the cage, and so having something that's an easy situation to clean up is going to be important. Most birds would like a cage that is more wide than it is tall. If you think about the way that birds move, it tends to be back and forth, and not necessarily up and down unless they're climbing. And so certainly the larger the cage, the better, but most birds, again, are going to prefer a wider cage than a taller cage. We also want that cage to be made out of non-toxic material. So things like stainless steel and coated metal. We certainly don't want things that have lead or zinc in them, because if birds chew on those cages, that's going to be a really good way for them to get exposed to toxic material. Adequate food and water containers. So I have a bird at home that you've met, Beiju, and he's got numerous food containers in his cage, as well as a few water bowls. Some birds really like to take their food and dip it into their water, and they basically make a soup, and it gets messy very quickly. So having a few containers in those cages as options for them to eat and drink out of is always a good thing. And also making sure that those containers are in a good location. So you don't want to put a water bowl right underneath the cage so that when the bird defecates, it goes right into either their water bowl or their food bowl. So making sure that all these things are placed throughout the cage is also important. And the last thing is making sure that the cage bar width is appropriate. And so if you look here on the right, this cage, that's a pretty large cage, and that's going to be appropriate for a larger parrot. If you have a small bird like a parrotlet, they're going to be able to squeeze through those bars pretty easily, and it's not going to really do its job of keeping the bird contained. It's also good if you can have play areas. So if you notice on this cage on the right, there's an area that the bird can actually get above the cage and have some outside activity, outside meaning outside of their cage. And so they can have a little bit more interaction with the people in their house that way, that they're not locked up into their cage. Perches are another important thing to think about. Birds perch pretty much all the time, so they never really lay down like we do to go to sleep. They do sit on a perch. And so keeping in mind the surface of the perch, the shape of it, the size of it, and in relation to what your bird is. And so if you've got a really small bird, having a very large perch may be difficult. Or if you've got a very large bird and a very small perch, they can sometimes have trouble actually holding on to it. And so keeping in mind that the perch needs to fit the size of the bird, And it's also good to have variable size and texture of those perches. So if you look at the perches on the right, this lovebird is sitting on a piece of wood. If you're going to use wood, that's fine. Just make sure it's a non-toxic wood. It hasn't been treated with anything. The bird on the right, that's a concrete perch, and those are okay to have in addition to other types of perches. I typically recommend having a mix of types of perches, and then the Amazon on the bottom is actually sitting on, it looks like actually a piece of metal that's probably part of the caging. And so having that variety of perches is going to allow them to not just sit in the same place and get wear on the bottom of their feet. And again, having non-toxic materials that are easy to clean is going to just make it a little bit easier for you to keep things clean. Another thing that some birds like, and I certainly don't recommend this for all birds, I previously owned finches and I decided that I was going to start covering them up, and all it did was really scare them. They got very, they would flutter a lot, and so I didn't cover them anymore because they just didn't like having a cage cover. But a lot of other birds really do like having that cage cover at night. It just gives them a secure environment. Typically something like an old blanket or a sheet is adequate. They certainly do market some, like this one here on the right, that can zip up and really, cover in that entire cage. And it just provides a dark, calm, quiet environment for that bird to sleep in at night. Other things to think about, and this is a little bit busy slide. If you look to the left, it's pretty busy, and so is the cage that the bird is in. And so a lot of people will put all kinds of toys in a cage, and that can be great as long as it's not overwhelming. And so having toys that the bird likes to interact with is fine. Just make sure that it's not completely crowding out their food bowls and their water bowls, and it's something that is enjoyable for them to actually work with. Just keep in mind again, so similar to our perches and our caging, that when you do provide toys, you want to make sure that you're providing things that are safe. So wood is great. They can certainly chew that up. Just again, make sure it hasn't been treated and it's nothing that's toxic. I tend to stay away from some of the things that are shown here. So things with string are a good way for our birds to actually either get the string caught around their toes and cause problems because of strangulation of the digits. And also sometimes they will ingest the string and can lead to gastrointestinal problems. And so I tend to stay away from things like string related toys. But wood, paper is also good. My bird really likes it when I give him phone books because it's just paper and he can shred everything up and just have a grand old time, and it's actually free. Just some of the suggestions down here that I've got. So it's non-toxic branches, corn cobs, paper towel rolls, natural fiber ropes. Those are going to degrade and they don't tend to get wrapped around like cotton thread would. Food items that you put into objects for environmental enrichment. Again, are paperback books, which would be similar to a phone book. And these are just a couple examples of toys. So again, this little conure on the left here has all kinds of toys, and whether he actually plays with them or not, I'm not sure. And that's going to depend on your bird. Some birds really like certain types of toys and not other types of toys. And just know that when you go to the pet store, a $20 toy isn't necessarily going to be better than a paper towel roll. It really depends on what your bird likes. This Quaker parrot here on the bottom has got a bunch of toys around him. And then actually the little budgie up on the right looks like it's actually a kid's toy that the bird is playing on. Just keep in mind though, so you notice there's also a large dog next to the bird. Just keep in mind that if you do have other animals in the house, that any interaction between your bird and those animals, be it a cat, a dog, another bird, really needs to be supervised, because otherwise things can happen that you really don't predict and can be deleterious, can be dangerous for those birds. Something else to consider depending on what type of bird you've got, and if you do have intentions for those birds to actually breed, is having a nest box. These hide boxes can be important for some birds. They like to sleep in them. Just keep in mind though that they can actually stimulate egg production. So if you have an animal, particularly one species that I think of are zebra finches, that they really do like to breed, and if you give them the opportunity in terms of a nesting box, they're going to just really keep reproducing and making eggs, and then you may have to actually remove those nest boxes so that they don't keep doing that. One of the last things to consider is if you are going to put nest boxes in or nesting material, to make sure that you've got material that isn't going to actually lead to a problem. So as we talked about with the toys, having things that have string are sometimes unfortunately a good way to get string caught around digits, or sometimes even wings, or sometimes they'll ingest them. And so making sure that you have things such as in this nest down here, so such as straw or shredded paper, is going to be a good nest material that you don't have to worry about the danger of it getting wrapped around toes and actually leading to problems. Another thing to consider is temperature. So most birds that we keep as pets actually do pretty well in our household temperatures. But depending on where they're from, they may have a little bit more, a little bit less tolerance to temperature. Birds can withstand fairly low temperatures if healthy, but if they are sick, that they may not be able to, and so you may need to provide extra heat to them. But they certainly can overheat, especially one thing that we consider when we're doing physical exams on birds. If we grab them up with a towel, they can overheat very quickly because of the stress, and we have that towel around them. Sick birds, as I mentioned, a lot of times we'll put them in warmed cages, and that may be in the hospital setting, or sometimes that can be arranged at home, and that's going to be an increased temperature over what we typically keep our homes at, which is about 85 to 90 degrees Fahrenheit. Humidity is another thing that can vary with species. So if you think about birds such as macaws or Amazon species, they're native to rainforests, and so higher humidity is generally going to be better for them and better for their feather quality. But if we think about birds such as budgerigars or cockatiels, they generally live in a more arid environment and aren't going to need additional humidity added to their lifestyle. And so one way that you can increase the humidity is a lot of birds actually, if you get a water mister, just so a plain water bottle, if you mist them, you can sometimes actually increase their feather quality, and so they just generally look better. Other birds actually do like to go in the shower with their owners and take showers with their owners. And so these are all ways that you can increase the humidity that those birds are exposed to. And kind of the last thing to keep in mind is when we talk about the different requirements of our birds, so whether it's their diet, their humidity, their temperature, we really need to keep in mind where these birds originally came from. So be it the deserts of Australia or the rainforests of South America or Africa, their requirements are going to vary, and it's really important either as a veterinarian or as a potential owner to research those things before you commit to that bird and before you really start instituting these things. So what's the best way to keep this bird, and can I really provide the appropriate husbandry for this bird so that it has the best environment that can possibly have in a captive situation?